great night this has been so far, huh? Yeah. So we're going to be reading Jeremiah and Lamentations these next couple of months. And as you've been able to see, we've been focusing on the heart this year in women's ministries. And in the book of Jeremiah, there's this verse: "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" Now, what is the context of this verse in Jeremiah? What was happening in the life of God's people that he would speak this message through one of his prophets? So let's look at that just for a couple of minutes. The prophetical books, which are the last 17 books in the Old Testament, they are somewhat cryptic, and reading the prophets can be somewhat daunting for Christians. And so there are a couple of things that you need to keep in mind when you're reading any of the books of the prophecies. There are two things, and one of them is, where does it fall? Where does that book fall, the message coming from that book? Where is it on the Old Testament timeline of the story of the Jewish people? And the second thing you need to remember and keep in mind is, to whom is the book directed? To whom is the prophet bringing God's message? So these two things will orient you so that it makes sense. So let's answer that first question about the book of Jeremiah. Where does it fall on the timeline? So the first 17 books of the Old Testament, the first 17 are the historical books, and they lay down the narrative of the timeline of the story of the Jewish people, who were Abraham's descendants. They were God's chosen people. And throughout these books, we see God's faithfulness to his people. Megan referenced this several times in her talk, and so he made covenants with them. He delivered them from slavery. He gave them the law to guide them. He brings them into their promised land, and he establishes the eternal throne through David's lineage, through whom the promised Messiah would come. Now, despite God's faithfulness to them, they over and over are unfaithful to God with idolatry, with immorality, with injustice. So God, and when we get to the book of 2 Kings, and that's the 12th book in the historical books, when we get to 2 Kings, we reach a very low point in the narrative of the Jewish people. And this is where the prophets enter. So God had established the kingly throne with righteous King David. And then David's son Solomon succeeds him, as we just heard Megan beautifully brought to us. But when Solomon's son Rehoboam comes to the throne, he was not righteous, and a civil war breaks out in Israel, and it divides the kingdom into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And during this time, because of the corruption of the leaders, that's the kings and the priests, and the rebellion of the people, God raised up a number of prophets to bring his message of warning to both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And the message, and God did this for asking them to abandon their idolatry, their immorality, and their injustice, and turn back to him. So the northern kingdom, they were unrelenting in their evil rebellion against God, and they were conquered and destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BC. That was the northern kingdom. Now the southern kingdom, around 626 BC, in the southern kingdom, which is the kingdom of Judah, Jeremiah, who was in his early 20s, was called by God to bring his message of warning during the reign of the last good king in Judah. And Jeremiah continued to prophesy, beginning with Josiah, King Josiah, all the way through the successive evil kings that followed him, all the way through to when Babylon came and captured the people, destroyed Jerusalem, and carried them into exile. Now his message, Jeremiah's message, included this. It included the inevitability of the destruction of Jerusalem. It is going to happen. And it also included Babylon will be the one to come and conquer you and take you into exile and destroy the city. But there was also a message of hope, in that the exile would only last for 70 years. So there was this message of hope. Now Jeremiah, he loved Judah and he loved God. And he was called the weeping prophet because he wept over the people's unrepentance and over the destruction of Jerusalem. As an eyewitness to these events, he wrote the book of Lamentations as a lament for what occurred to Judah and Jerusalem. But Jeremiah does understand that the Babylonians were God's tool for bringing judgment on Jerusalem, but also knows that even in terrible judgment, that God is still a God of hope. And in Lamentations, we read this verse: "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." So watch for the message of hope as you read these books. Some of the verses Megan referenced in Jeremiah were messages of hope within that judgment. And watch also for messianic prophecies, which are also give hope as you read these two books of prophecy.